earlier said, what we're going to do is to give a sort of a potted version, as it were, of the talk that we gave at the History Day a few years ago about the Fanu connection with Abington. And it is a strong one. And there's no doubt in my mind that the experience of Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu in Abington certainly had an influence on the kind of writer that he subsequently became. As many of you will know, he was born on the 28th of August 1814 at 45 Lower Dominic Street, Dublin. On his father's side, comfortable middle-class family, Huguenot stock, merchants and bankers, and his paternal grandmother was the sister of the playwright Richard Brinsley Sheridan. Now, in 1815, his father, Thomas Le Fanu, was appointed to the post of chaplain to the military academy in the Phoenix Park in Dublin. And he occupied that position for 11 years. The family lived in a place that I'm probably going to pronounce wrongly, a Chapel Izod or Chapel Izod. And there is I think is the house. And it's what you might call, I suppose, a comfortable billet. Certainly, the Le Fanu family seemed to have very little sense of life outside the Pale. But in 1823, he was appointed as rector of Abington. And Abington then was simply an obscure spot on the map. There was nothing here, basically. A few houses, a church, and nothing much else, because, of course, Glenstall Castle hadn't yet been built, and the village of Maru didn't exist. But economic circumstances led to his operating for the first 3 years of his tenure as an absentee rector. He simply didn't have the money to move his family from Dublin to Abington. And we have here a slide which refers to a sermon preached by Thomas Le Fanu in 1825 in Dublin, which shows really that he was operating more in Dublin than here. Most of the duties in Abington were undertaken by his curate. But the issue was resolved in 1826 by his additional appointment to the rectorship of Emly. And he moved with his family, his wife, and 3 children, Catherine, 13, Joseph, 12 years old, and William, 11, with their nanny, a tutor, to the rectory. Now, the rectory, I think you're going to see that later on this afternoon. It was built in 1804 as the glebe house, and its first occupant was a man of some considerable stature, and that was the Reverend John Jebb, who served as rector of Abington until he was appointed, or he became Bishop of Limerick in 1823. Now, in a way, I feel a bit sorry for Thomas Le Fanu, because Jebb was, to say the least, a very, very hard act to follow. He was extremely popular in Abington, both with the Catholic parishioners and with the Protestant parishioners, and he enjoyed an extremely good relationship with the Catholic priest here, Father Costello, simply because Jebb respected, liked all his parishioners, Catholic, Protestant alike, and they liked him very much. So really, Abington at that time was a settled place in which relationships were pretty good. But unfortunately for Thomas Lefanu, the situation when the Lefanu family moved to Abington here was difficult. Situation was extremely tense. There were different reasons for that, but the relationship between Catholic and Protestant at Abington at that time was a difficult one. There were 6,000 Catholics in Abington and very few Protestants, simply a handful. And in many cases, the services had to be cancelled because of insufficient numbers. But just to give an idea of the sources of tension in the parish, I just want to quote the words of Father Costello, the Catholic parish priest, in the evidence he gave to the House of Commons Select Committee in London in 1825 regarding the state of the Church in Ireland, the tensions which were felt at the time. And he said that in Abington parish, the Catholics, and I'll quote him directly here, feel the degradation which, small though the number of persons, now he's talking about the Protestant parishioners here, small though the number of persons in the parish is excited by the supercilious conduct of some of these persons towards them in their transactions of life, showing that they feel a superiority by which others are degraded. Now, those are strong words, but it just gives you some idea of the inherent hostility that the Lefanus faced when they arrived. The other thing, of course, that made the situation considerably worse was the endemic violence and lawlessness in the region. There were gang fights, murders, assassinations, and so on. And this was not confined to Abington, of course, it was pretty widespread. And again, just quoting the words of Charles Stewart Trench, who was a land agent in the Midlands, and he says, to give you an idea of the situation, in disturbed times, when several murders had been committed in the neighbourhood, we habitually took our arms with us into the dining room and ate our meals with our loaded pistols on the table beside us and our guns leaning against the chimney piece. He says, it is surprising when one gets accustomed to it, how little this affects the appetite or weighs upon the mind. Well, it's a good job, isn't it, really, if you've got that situation going on. Now, the family's situation got worse at the outbreak of the Tithe Wars, following Catholic emancipation, and a lot of violence was directed to the class to which the Lefanus belonged. And in the words of John Wickham, Thomas Lefanu's curate, he says, a set of ruffians are in the daily habit, in their passage to and from a bog in the neighbourhood of Dean Lefanu's residence, of using the most horrid threats and imprecations against that gentleman and his family, threatening them with the fate of the Reverend Messrs. Going and Whitty, who were murdered. And the daily and hourly insults to every member of the Dean of Emley's family are disgusting and terrific beyond measure. So it was a very, very uncomfortable time, really, for all of them. If you read William Lefanu's portrayal in 70 Years of Irish Life, he gives a rather more positive picture of the relationship. He gives the impression that the family were really quite well liked, but again, it's a difficult thing to weigh up. This may be rather a sort of a rosy-coloured picture. So there you have it, the Fanu family in their really rather impressive rectory. And you can only imagine, I think, the effect on a sensitive, intelligent, bookish boy, which Joseph was, of all that was going on around him. Because there's evidence that, in fact, a lot of the gang fights and the disturbances could be heard in the rectory, because quite a lot of them took place around the area of the Abington graveyard. And so therefore he must have known and heard what was actually going on. But he was there, educated by his father, who had an extensive library, and he seems to have spent a lot of his time on the roof, thinking, reflecting, and looking out at the landscape. Beautiful view from that. But there's a lot of evidence that all this disturbance had a serious effect on members of his family, and certainly on Catherine Fanu. For the last 10 years of her life, she was confined to the rectory as a semi-invalid. And though she became the centre of the family, she, more than any of her brothers, was exposed to the hostility in the area. Because, of course, eventually, Joseph and William departed for Dublin. He went in 1832 to Trinity, to his studies, and to eventually a career in journalism and in politics. William to a career in engineering. Now, it's difficult not to feel very sorry for Catherine Fanu, because she was certainly aware of the fragile nature of the family. There they were, practically imprisoned in this rectory, belonging to a class, the ascendancy, with no real power, no real authority, and in some ways helpless victims. She died on March the 25th, 1841, and she, along with a good many others of the Abington family, of the Fanu family, was buried in Abington graveyard. And there you have the notice of the death of Catherine. Now, she wasn't always an invalid, and William, in 70 Years of Irish Life, records that in 1893 there were still old people in Abington speaking of the good Miss Catherine and her good works. But there's no doubt that her death deeply affected Joseph and Thomas. And interestingly, in one of his late stories, Sheridan Le Fanu talks about Catherine. The story is called The Child That Went with the Fairies, and it talks about the death of a child, little Billy, and he writes, "Others whom affection cherished lay in holy ground in the old churchyard of Abington." Now, critics have debated as to why, in fact, he never came back to Abington, even though he clearly felt a nostalgia for the area. And my guess is that he may well have felt a certain degree of guilt at having, so to speak, abandoned his sister in that rectory. Now, I think Grania has a little bit to say about the other Abingtons who are buried in Abington graveyard. Would you like to say a little bit to that? because there are many of them. And you're going down to the graveyard, I think, later on, are you?
Yes. That's
Yeah.
right.
So the Abington, the Lefanu tomb there contains a great many Lefenus.
And there is, yeah. It was just a trawl of the church burial records, and I discovered there are actually 6 people buried in the graveyard. Catherine, as we see, is Jane Ferguson, who was Mrs. Lefenu's sister. She came for a visit and died, and was buried in Abington. And then a nephew, Richard Fleming, came. That poor devil had a really tough time because he was attacked during the Tide Wars as well. But he had a heart condition, and he came for his visit and died and was buried in Abington. And then Maria Knowles came for a visit and died and was buried in Abington.
Lots of deaths.
He was the Reverend Lefenu's, his own niece. And he specifies that they're all buried together, so we know this is true, as you can see. Then he died himself in 1845, so he joined them, and that's mentioned in the New Guardian. And the last then, and that was the end of the Lefenu's connection with Abington, I suppose, was in 1861 when Mrs. Lefenu, the mother of the writer, died, and her body was brought to Abington to be buried with her family. So dangerous to come and visit them, but there we have it. That's the last entry of a mention of the Lefenus in the registers of Abington. And that's it.
Thanks, Ronnie. Yeah. So Thomas Lefanu, when he died, left nothing. He had to sell off his library, and his widow went back to Dublin to live with William. Now, as some of you may know, Sheridan Lefanu himself died in 1873. His death was largely unexplained. Nobody really knows. We know that he went into isolation, and just before his death, he was known as the Invisible Prince because nobody had seen him really much for a while. And he seems to have had a dream, or a succession of dreams, of a house collapsing on him. And his doctor, when he finally died, his doctor said, "At last the house has fallen." Now, make what you will of that. There's obviously something of deep psychological significance there. But I've just got a couple of minutes left, I think, just to say at the end what I think, why I think that his time in Abington was absolutely pivotal to the kind of writing that he did and the kind of novelist that he became. And to my mind, there are 2 important factors. One was that his time in Abington must have given him a very clear idea of what it meant to be a member of the ascendancy. A class hated, despised, a class whose decline was more or less inevitable, but people imprisoned in great houses, crumbling estates, people going quietly mad, haunted by guilt. It's all in the novels. It's all in the stories. And so therefore, to my mind, that this is where the Gothic comes into contact with the Great House novel. And that's the unique contribution, to my mind, of Irish Gothic as opposed to other kinds of Gothic. And you'll be talking about that a bit more later on. And the second thing, and very, very important, is his attitude towards the landscape around here. Because, as many of you may know, this area was much wilder in Lefenu's time than it is now, because the Barrington estate, the parklands and so on had not been laid out, and the area was both beautiful but also quite frightening, quite sinister, quite dramatic. And if you if you go up onto the Slieve Phelan and the weather closes in, it's not a comfortable place to be. And still, if, as some of you may have done, you walk up what they call the ravine at Glenstall, up to the Mass Rock, and the weather is bad, you still get a sense of a certain degree of eeriness. And I think one of Le Fanu's stories is actually set in that particular place. So this links him up with other writers, other Irish writers, who were looking at the Irish landscape as a place of beauty, but also very sinister, a place where spectral beings could very easily be encountered at any time. I'm thinking of writers like Gerald Griffin, like John Banim, people like that. And the landscape setting becomes important in Le Fanu's fiction, I think, for that reason. So that's my take on why this Abington period is so critical for the kind of writer that we're dealing with. But lots more to come, I'm sure. That's my bit done. Thank you.